Picture a letter. It arrives by longboat, under a white flag, at the edge of a swamp so tangled that the British officers who sent it had to pay local fishermen just to find the channel. The year is September 1814. The War of 1812 is grinding into its third year, and the British Empire, fresh from burning Washington to the ground, is turning its eyes south toward the jewel of the Mississippi, New Orleans. The letter is addressed to Jean Lafitte. It offers him $30,000, a captain's commission in the Royal Navy, land grants in the colonies. All he has to do is turn his guns and his men and his knowledge of every hidden waterway south of the city against the United States. He reads it, he considers it, and then he does something no one expects. He warns the Americans instead. This is the story of a man who smuggled, who stole, who trafficked in human beings, and who, for one violent winter, became the unlikely savior of an American city. It is also the story of what a nation does with its saviors once the smoke clears. This is the story of Jean Lafitte. To understand Jean Lafitte, you first have to understand the world he moved through. And that world begins with the mouth of the Mississippi River. In the early 1800s, New Orleans was less an American city than a colonial crossroads that happened to fly the stars and stripes. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 had brought it under American control barely a decade earlier, and the city still spoke French, traded in Spanish silver, and operated on a set of social rules that baffled the Anglo-American administrators sent to govern it. Creole merchants, free people of color, enslaved Africans, Haitian refugees, Spanish officials, and American frontiersmen all collided in its streets. It was the gateway to the entire interior of the continent. Whoever controlled New Orleans controlled the Mississippi, and whoever controlled the Mississippi controlled the economy of the young republic. The War of 1812, often remembered as a footnote in American history, was anything but for the people of the Gulf Coast. Britain and the United States had been fighting since June 1812 over maritime rights, impressment of American sailors, and territorial ambitions in Canada. By the summer of 1814, Napoleon had abdicated, freeing tens of thousands of seasoned British soldiers and sailors for deployment across the Atlantic. The burning of Washington in August 1814, the only time a foreign power has captured and torched the American capital, was a signal of intent. The Gulf Coast was next, and into this volatile geography stepped a man whose profession was, by any legal definition, piracy. Jean Lafitte's origins are, fittingly, a matter of dispute. He was likely born around 1780, probably in the French port of Bordeaux, though claims of birth in Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti, also circulate and cannot be confirmed. What is documented is that by 1805 or 1806, he and his older brother Pierre had established themselves in New Orleans as merchants of a particular kind. They sold goods that had never passed through a customs house. The brothers ran their operation out of Barataria Bay, a labyrinth of marshy islands, tidal channels, and cypress swamps about 40 miles south of New Orleans. It was, in practical terms, a smuggler's paradise. Shallow enough to prevent large naval vessels from entering, remote enough to avoid regular patrols, and close enough to the city to supply its markets within a day. By 1810, the Lafitte operation at Barataria had grown from a modest smuggling outpost into something closer to a private trading republic. And here, the record demands honesty. A significant portion of the Lafitte brothers' income came from the slave trade. After the United States banned the importation of enslaved Africans in 1808, demand did not vanish. It went underground, and men like the Lafittes supplied it. Enslaved people were brought to Barataria from captured Spanish and Portuguese slave ships and sold to Louisiana plantation owners at prices well below legal market rates. This was not a peripheral activity. It was central to the Barataria economy, and any account of Lafitte that omits it is telling a fairy tale, not history. Alongside the slave trade, the Baratarians dealt in every kind of contraband the Gulf could produce: silk, spices, wine, furniture, and above all, weapons and gunpowder. Lafitte held, or claimed to hold, a letter of marque from the Republic of Cartagena, a breakaway state in present-day Colombia, which technically authorized him to prey on Spanish shipping. Whether this letter made him a privateer or merely a pirate with paperwork has been debated for 2 centuries. The distinction mattered to Lafitte. It mattered less to the U.S. government. Governor William C. Claiborne of Louisiana saw the Baratarians as criminals. Plain and simple. In 1813, he issued a proclamation offering $500 for the arrest of Jean Lafitte. Lafitte's response, according to well-established local tradition, was to post his own handbills offering $5,000 for the delivery of the governor. Whether this actually happened or is embroidery added by admiring New Orleanians, it captured a truth about the power dynamic. In Barataria, Lafitte was the law and the governor was a nuisance. The fleet at Barataria at its peak numbered perhaps a dozen armed vessels, mostly schooners and feluccas suited to the shallow coastal waters, crewed by a polyglot mix of French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Haitian, and African sailors. They were not a navy, but they were experienced fighters, skilled gunners, and, critically, they possessed enormous stores of flints, gunpowder, and cannon shot. This last detail would become the hinge of history. On September 3, 1814, a British sloop appeared off the coast of Barataria under a flag of truce. It carried Captain Nicholas Lockyer of the Royal Navy and Captain McWilliams of the Royal Marines, along with a package of letters addressed to Jean Lafitte. The offer was extraordinary. In exchange for the Baratarians, assistance in the coming assault on New Orleans, their knowledge of the waterways, their ships, and their fighting men, Britain would pay Lafitte $30,000, grant him a commission as a captain in the Royal Navy, and guarantee land grants for his men. All past acts of piracy would be forgiven. Lafitte asked for 2 weeks to consider. He entertained the British officers politely, fed them well, and sent them back to their ships. Then he sat down and wrote a letter to the Americans. His letter, which still survives in the archives, went to Jean Blanc, a member of the Louisiana legislature and an associate of the Laffittes. In it, Lafitte laid out the British plans, enclosed copies of the British correspondence, and offered to place himself and his men at the service of the United States. His conditions were modest: a full pardon for himself, his brother Pierre, and his men. The reaction in New Orleans was mixed. Governor Claiborne, who had spent years trying to shut the Baratarians down, was suspicious. He believed the letters might be a trap. Commodore Daniel Patterson of the U.S. Navy saw an opportunity not to ally with the pirates but to destroy them. On September 16, 1814, while Lafitte's offer was still being debated, Patterson launched a raid on Barataria with a small naval force. The Baratarians, under Lafitte's orders, did not resist. The Americans seized ships, goods, and prisoners. Lafitte himself escaped into the swamps. It was, by any measure, a catastrophic piece of timing. The British were coming, and the Americans had just destroyed the one force that might help defend the city. Enter Andrew Jackson. Jackson arrived in New Orleans on December 1, 1814, to take command of the city's defense. He was gaunt, sick with dysentery, and furious. He had already called the Baratarians hellish banditti, thieves unworthy of trust. But Jackson was also a pragmatist, and what he found when he surveyed his defences was alarming. He had roughly 4,000 troops, a patchwork of U.S. Army regulars, Tennessee and Kentucky militia, Mississippi dragoons, free black soldiers from New Orleans, and Choctaw warriors. What he did not have was ammunition. Specifically, he was desperately short of flints for his muskets and powder for his cannon. The Baratarians had both, in enormous quantities. Edward Livingston, a prominent New Orleans attorney and Jackson's unofficial political advisor, brokered the deal. Lafitte met Jackson personally. The exact date and location are disputed, but most historians place it in mid-December 1814 at Jackson's headquarters on Royal Street. Lafitte offered 7,000 flints, enough powder, and shot to supply Jackson's batteries for weeks and the services of his best gunners. In return, he asked again for pardons. Jackson agreed. Whatever his personal feelings about smugglers, the math was unanswerable. The Battle of New Orleans unfolded on January 8, 1815, along a narrow strip of sugarcane fields between the Mississippi River and an impassable cypress swamp. Jackson's defensive line, a mud and cotton bale rampart known as Line Jackson, stretched across this corridor about 5 miles south of the city. On the other side, roughly 8,000 British regulars, many of them veterans of the Peninsular War against Napoleon, prepared to advance. The Baratarians were deployed in two critical positions. Dominique You, Lafitte's chief lieutenant and possibly his half-brother, commanded Battery No. 3 on the main line, while Renato Beluche commanded a battery on the west bank of the Mississippi. These men were not amateurs. They had spent years firing shipboard cannon in naval engagements across the Caribbean. Their accuracy was, by multiple accounts, devastating. The British assault began at dawn in heavy fog. As the mist lifted, the red-coated columns advanced across open ground into the teeth of Jackson's defences. The American artillery, including the Baratarian batteries, opened fire at range. What followed was one of the most lopsided engagements in military history. Within roughly 2 hours, the British suffered over 2,000 casualties, including the death of their commanding officer, Major General Sir Edward Pakenham, who was killed leading a charge. American losses were approximately 70, 13 dead, 39 wounded, 19 missing. The Baratarian gunners were singled out for praise. Jackson himself, in his official dispatches, commended their gallantry and courage. Dominique You reportedly maintained such rapid and precise fire that British officers later remarked that Battery 3 had been the deadliest point on the American line. For one bright morning in January, the smugglers of Barataria were American heroes. The legend of Jean Lafitte, as it hardened in the decades after 1815, turned him into something he was not: a gentleman pirate, a Robin Hood of the bayou, a principled rogue who stole from the Spanish and gave to the Americans out of patriotic love. The record is more complicated. First, the patriotism. Lafitte's letter to Blanc was undeniably real, and his decision to warn the Americans rather than accept the British offer was consequential. But his motives were almost certainly mixed. The British were offering money and rank, but they were also offering to invade his operating territory. A British-controlled New Orleans would have been far harder for the Baratarians to work with than an American-controlled one. Lafitte's choice may have been as much about protecting his business as defending his adopted country. The historical consensus, as expressed by historians like William C. Davis in his 2005 biography, is that Lafitte was shrewd, not sentimental. Second, the personal heroism. Popular tradition places Lafitte on the firing line at the Battle of New Orleans, loading cannon alongside his men. There is no reliable contemporary evidence for this. What is documented is that Lafitte played a critical logistical and advisory role, supplying munitions, providing intelligence about the waterways, and helping position the batteries. His lieutenants, Dominique You and Renato Beluche, were the ones on the line. Lafitte's contribution was strategic, not cinematic. Third, the slavery. The post-war legend erased this almost entirely. 19th century accounts cast Lafitte as a dashing privateer who preyed only on enemy shipping. The reality that a substantial portion of his income derived from trafficking enslaved human beings was quietly set aside. Modern scholarship has restored it, but the romantic image persists in popular culture, and it is worth naming the distortion plainly. Jean Lafitte's afterlife in popular culture has been long and wildly inaccurate. He appeared as a character in Cecil B. DeMille's 1938 film The Buccaneer, played by Frederick March, and again in the 1958 remake with Yul Brynner, both films treating him as an unambiguous hero. Several 1950s television series featured fictionalized versions of Lafitte as a dashing ally or anti-hero. In the Disneyland and Walt Disney World ride Pirates of the Caribbean, a figure widely interpreted as Lafitte appears in the ride. though Disney has never officially confirmed the identification. More recently, Lafitte has become a fixture in Louisiana tourism. A town in Jefferson Parish bears his name. A National Historical Park, Jean Lafitte National Historical Park and Preserve, was established in 1978, encompassing parts of the Barataria region. Blacksmith shops, bars and restaurants across the French Quarter claim connections to him, most of them invented. The pattern is familiar. A complicated, morally compromised historical figure, flattened into a brand. What gets kept is the swagger. What gets lost is the cost, to the people he enslaved, to the merchants he robbed, and ultimately to himself. And that cost is where this story finds its weight. On February 6, 1815, President James Madison signed a proclamation granting a full pardon to the Baratarians who had fought at New Orleans. The legal slate was wiped clean, but the property seized in Commodore Patterson's September raid, the ships, the goods, the weapons that had not been donated to the war effort, was never returned. The courts upheld the seizures. The government took the Baratarians' help, took their ammunition, took their blood, and then kept their property. Lafitte tried to rebuild. By 1817, he had established a new base on Galveston Island, off the coast of Spanish Texas, operating again under a letter of marque, this time from the Mexican insurgency. He called the settlement Campeche. For a few years, it functioned much as Barataria had, a smuggling port, a privateer base, a small republic of outcasts. But the United States, having used Lafitte, had no further patience for him. In 1821, the U.S. Navy ordered him to leave Galveston. Lafitte burned Campeche to the ground rather than hand it over, loaded his remaining men onto his flagship, and sailed into the Gulf of Mexico. He was never reliably seen again. What happened to Jean Lafitte after 1821 is one of the enduring mysteries of Gulf Coast history. Some accounts place his death around 1823, possibly off the coast of Honduras, possibly of fever, possibly in a skirmish with Spanish warships. A journal attributed to Lafitte surfaced in the 20th century, claiming he lived into old age under an assumed name, but its authenticity is disputed by most scholars. There is no confirmed grave, no death certificate, no final port of call. The nation he helped save offered him a pardon and then looked the other way, while the machinery of law stripped him of everything he had built. The hero of January became the inconvenience of February. The man who supplied the flints that fired the guns that killed the British general who might have taken New Orleans. That man was told, politely and firmly, to leave. Somewhere in the Gulf of Mexico, in 1821 or 1822, a ship with no flag sailed south. Maybe it was a schooner, maybe a brig. The records don't agree, and the men aboard had every reason to leave no records at all. The captain, if that is what he still was, had been, at various points in his life, a smuggler, a privateer, a slave trader, a spy, a patriot, and a fugitive. He had dined with generals and governors. He had been toasted in the halls of New Orleans and hunted through its courts. He had held the fate of a city in his hands for exactly as long as the city needed him to, and not one day longer. The Gulf swallowed him the way it swallows everything, slowly, silently, without ceremony. There are people in Louisiana who will tell you that Lafitte buried treasure in the bayous, gold doubloons, Spanish silver, jewels from captured galleons. They have been telling this story for 200 years. No one has ever found a single coin. Perhaps that is the most honest epitaph for a man like Jean Lafitte. Not the treasure that was never found, but the debt that was never paid. The sea keeps its own accounts.